be trying to lecture whatever I can. I need to, of course, wrap up talking about ancient Greece, like I said. And then, of course, I do need to also, if I have time, hopefully I do today, I want to at least try to start on trying to get in the Hellenistic age, talking about Alexander the Great, because Alexander, kind of a short historical period that comes in at the end of the Greek period. So next week, I'm going to be moving on to talk about the Roman period. So talk about the history of Rome and the Roman Empire, which that'll probably take up a couple days, doing that. So we are getting closer to the end of the semester, because I think we're pretty much, I'm just about halfway through pretty much right now, just about of all the lecture material I'm probably going to do for the semester. So anyway, let me continue, of course. I think from last time we had gotten up to the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. I think it's about where it was from last time. And I think I was talking about how the Greeks had created this defensive league after the Persian Wars was kind of coming to an end. Like they kind of kept going, the Persian Wars, down to about the mid-5th century BC. But they wanted to form this alliance, if you remember correctly, because they were thinking that the Persians might come back. And so this defensive alliance included all the different Greek city-states that were in it. And of course, I told you that the headquarters was on the island of Delos, which was in the Aegean Sea. I already talked about this already, kind of going back into it again and reviewing it. And I think I may have mentioned that Athens eventually came to dominate it. They basically were the main state that really controlled it over time. They basically took it. They formed an empire out of it, later called the Athenian Empire, which peaked in the 5th century BC. And it was more of a trading alliance with all the different Ionian states throughout the Aegean at the time. Now, get into, of course, this new period that comes in kind of afterwards in the 5th century BC. Like when the Athenian Empire existed, they usually call that period the Age of Pericles, or sometimes called, you see on the bottom, the Golden Age of Athens. It's really the peak of the city-states, especially Athens' power and culture. And Pericles was an Athenian general and politician. He had been involved in several victories at the end of the Persian Wars. And he basically took over the state around 461 BC. It would be in power about 30 years, roughly. And what happened eventually was he's the one that actually moved the treasury of the Delian League, which was in the Temple of Apollo, to Athens. And so after that, Athens used that money to basically become a more powerful state. And from there, they were able to create this empire. And so the period afterwards was called the so-called Age of Pericles, which is about a 30-year period. Like I said, Golden Age of Athens. And it's a peak period of Greek culture when Athens really was at its most famous power overall. And kind of go through and talk about Pericles. Pericles, who I have a picture of, which is right here, some statues of him. Pericles was known for a lot of things. I think I mentioned earlier how Pericles was one of those Athenian Greek politicians that created a lot of reforms, kind of like Solon did and Cleisthenes at Athens back in the previous century. And Pericles was the one that rebuilt the Acropolis because the Persians had come in under Xerxes the Great. They had sacked the city and burned it. And so under Pericles, they began this massive reconstruction of the Acropolis, which included several temples that were built that are still there today, with the most famous being, of course, the Parthenon temple that was completed in the year 432 BC about. And the Parthenon was, of course, if you know about it, a famous temple that was built to honor the soldiers that had died in the war. And it also, of course, was a temple that honored the goddess Athena, who was their patron goddess the daughter of Zeus, the god of war and culture, etc. So he was famous for that, and a bunch of other temples like Temple Athena, Nike, etc. They were all built there as well. And also Pericles was a big sponsor of like Greek culture. It's under him that Athens spends a lot of money on the actual state, the public stuff, public, I guess, fare. And so artists, sculptors, dramatists, architects, etc. All these people, that were like some kind of artists or whatever, were all supported by Pericles. He also expanded democracy, you can see there. Yeah, he did expand their naval power as well, because under him, the Athenian navy reached its peak of power, more or less. Here's a map showing you, of course, the so-called Athenian Empire and all the areas that they controlled at one point. So all the areas in yellow, and you see that area is kind of in pink. All that area is basically the area that was made up of the so-called Athenian Empire, which I told you formed out of the Delian League originally. However, what happened with Pericles died around 429 BC. Athens went through a really bad period where they had these plagues that broke out, apparently, at the end of the golden age of Athens. And I think there's different theories on it. They seem to think it was either bubonic plague or some people think it was a typhus type illness that may have ravaged the population, but they do think it wiped out maybe close to a third or fourth of the population of Athens. That played a role in why Athens declined. Then they had the Peloponnesian War that broke out as well. The Peloponnesian War was like this civil war that was fought between the Ionian and the Dorian states throughout Greece. The Ionians and Dorians never really liked each other too much. And so they formed these two rival alliances against each other. One was called the Delian League, which is the one that was basically the Athenian Empire, of course, backed by Athens and its navy. Then the Peloponnesian League had this confederation of states that included Sparta, Thebes, and also Corinth that were in it. This map kind of shows you a better view of where the different states and regions were, but most of Boeotia and the Peloponnese and up there around Macedonia were all kind of aligned together. Then you see all the orange areas. It's basically where the Ionian states were. They were part of the Athenian Empire and their allies, etc. And I think that map also shows you the differences in like strategy that were used, by both sides in the war, where the Spartan side, their confederation, of course, used a lot of their land armies to try to attack Athens. And Athens got so desperate, they even built fortified walls to block like the Spartans from coming in. And then the Athenians tried to rely more on their navy and all of that. And that's where their Achilles heel was, if you know about it. And what caused the Athenian Empire to eventually collapse was their navy. Eventually got wiped out by the end of the war. And after that, Sparta and Thebes were able to use their land armies to basically force the Athenians to basically sue for peace and end the war. And so Athens after that declined. And Sparta and Thebes into the 4th century BC become really the big powers. But you're going to see later, but over time, Macedonia, which you see way up there in the north on that map, is eventually going to come down, and they're going to take more control of the region, more or less. So that was the peak period of Athens and the so-called golden age of Athens, they dub it, or sometimes called Greece. And the Greek city-states really start to decline after that, and they're not the same as it was before. All right, let me go ahead and, of course, review a little bit, and then, of course, I will move on to talk about Greek culture. It says, on what peninsulas did Sparta and Athens develop in Greece? Sparta developed on the Peloponnese or Peloponnesus, and Athens was on the Attica Peninsula. What was the name of the ancient region where Sparta developed in southern Greece? It was called Lacedaemon or Lacedaemonia, but now they call it Laconia. Who were the Helots that Spartans used to farm their land? Helots were these agricultural slaves or serfs that they subjugated the Spartans. And so the Spartans mostly developed their military because of them being outnumbered by them. King Lycurgus was the founding father of the Dorian Spartan state. He was the one who created their constitution, their military school. What was the Agog? The Agog was the Spartan military school, where Spartan boys were trained for war. What was Athens famous for as a city-state? Athens was famous for its Greek culture, democracy. They were also known for maritime power, trade, like exporting like olive oil. They're very well known for their Athenian navy that was peaked in the 5th century. Why was Athenian politician Solon important for making reforms, etc.? Solon was one of the founding fathers of Athenian democracy. Him and Cleisthenes, I guess. And Solon was known for forming like the Council of 400, the Ecclesia. I think I told you about the, what else did I talk about? I think I told you how he developed the Areopagus, which was their Supreme Court type system they had, and a bunch of other reforms. And then Cleisthenes was known for more democratic reforms. He was the one that gave all citizens more equality, and he developed the Council of 500 as well. What were the Greco-Persian Wars? The Greco-Persian Wars were a series of wars fought between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire that was fought in the early 5th century BC. So that's called just Persian Wars. The main cause of the wars was due to the Persian Empire pushing into the Aegean world, like close to Turkey and the Mediterranean Sea. And it broke out in Ionia, the so-called Ionian Revolt, which broke out about 499 BC. The main historian who wrote about the wars was, of course, Herodotus, the so-called father of history. He's the one that wrote the history of the war, histories of Herodotus, which are also sometimes called the history of the Persian Wars. Who led the first invasion? Well, it wasn't led. It was actually sent by King Darius or Darius the Great. He sent the first invasion, 490. That led to the Battle of Marathon. The Battle of Marathon, of course, was the first Greek victory over the Persian forces, which was fought on Attica Peninsula, and it basically forced Darius the Great's forces to basically retreat back to Persia. Phidippides was this messenger or fast Greek runner that was supposedly involved with the Battle of Marathon. He was the one that was famous for his so-called victory run to Athens, which is about 26.2 miles, but they're not sure if it's a real true story or not. It's where they get the marathon run from later. Who led the second invasion of Greece in 480 BC? That was Xerxes the Great, the son of Darius the Great. Xerxes attempted to invade through northern Greece, to conquer Greece. What strategy did the Greeks develop against the Persians when they formed a military alliance? The Greeks decided to block the northern passes of Greece to prevent the Persians from invading and to also slow them down so they could bring up reinforcements. What occurred at the Battle of Thermopylae on August 480 BC? The Greeks, with a small army, about 7,000, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, tried to basically stop the Persians at Thermopylae Pass. They were wiped out. Most of them were wiped out that stayed. But it demoralized, they think, Xerxes' forces. He lost like 20,000, 30,000 men. The main Spartan, of course, that king at Thermopylae, I told you, was King Leonidas. They also say sometimes Leonidas or Leonidas is usually how they pronounce it. Either one's fine. What naval battle changed the course of the world and eventually led to the Greeks winning? That was the Battle of Salamis, which the famous general Themistocles led. What was the Delian League? I just talked about that. The Delian League was, like I said, a military alliance that the Greeks formed against the Persians. And of course, the Greeks used it to, like Athens, used it to form the Athenian Empire out of it. Age of Pericles was a 30-year period in the mid-5th century from about 461 to 429 when Pericles dominated Athens and the Aegean. And his state later formed the Athenian Empire. Pericles was famous for rebuilding the Acropolis at Athens, like including the Parthenon. He also was known for being a big patron of the arts for Athens, and he also supported democracy and also expanded their navy. The war that caused the downfall of the Athenian Empire, of course, was the Peloponnesian War, which I talked about. All right, moving on, I need to talk about next, of course, Greek culture. That's the next thing we really got to get into and talk a little bit about, of course, today. So Greek culture, more or less. Now, the Greeks were known for a lot of different culture, which a lot of it was based at Athens, which is, true about that overall. And kind of get into that. I need to first talk about the Olympics, Olympic Games, of course, that take place. And of course, the Greek Olympics are very, very famous. They now do the modern Olympics more or less today. And in ancient Greece, there were actually 5 different games that were put on annually, like every so many years in Greece. And of course, the Olympic Games was the most prestigious one, what I'll talk about today, which was based at Olympia. The Pythian Games at Delphi, which was in Boeotia, that honored the Oracle of Pythia, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. Isthmian Games were held at Corinth. The Nemean Games were held at Argos, and the Panathenea was held at Athens, which honored, by the way, Pan and Athena. So they didn't just have the Olympic Games; they had all these other games that they put on as well. But the Olympic Games was the one that went back the furthest and was the most famous overall. Now, the Olympic Games, of course, they think they started maybe in the 8th century BC. 776 BC is usually the popular date that they usually put it at, more or less. And it was held in the northwestern part of the Peloponnese, where, of course, the city-state of Olympia is, of course. And it was held every 4 summers, which, of course, if you know about that, that's now a unit of time they still use today, which is called an Olympiad. Like they still do at the modern Olympics, with the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics rotated every 4 summers. And like during that time, the Greek city-states would actually have what they call an Olympic peace, where they wouldn't fight each other, or Olympic truce. So they wouldn't fight each other. They put down their arms. Later, when the Roman Empire came, you got the Romans come in, and they also join as well as athletes and so on. And the reason why they held the games at Olympia was because there was a huge temple there, a temple to Zeus that had been built a long time ago. Supposedly the largest statue of Zeus ever built. It was at one point, the temple itself was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It doesn't exist anymore, of course, now. And there were different games that were put on at one point with the ancient Olympics. The most famous, of course, athletic event that was done is that one at the top. It's called the pentathlon, which you may have heard of, which for a while they used to do the pentathlon in some of the early Olympics. I don't think they do it anymore. But it's a 5-sport event which involves those 5 different athletic competitions: discus throw, Greco-Roman wrestling, foot racing, which is probably likely just, like 100 meters or something like that, long jump, and then, of course, the javelin, which they think some of these, like the javelin, etc., probably came from warfare originally. They did have blood sports also as well. The 3 main blood sports, of course, were wrestling, like Greco-Roman wrestling, boxing, and Pankration was like a form of kind of like Greek martial arts, which is kind of a cross between boxing and wrestling. If you know about Pankration, it's still kind of around today, of course. In MMA is pretty much, mixed martial arts is like you see on TV is pretty much what that is. Also, they had chariot racing, which, believe it or not, was very popular as well because horse racing was real big, and people could bet on it. And like in the Greek Roman world, it would be a big thing. Like in Rome, they had the Circus Maximus. The Byzantine Empire had the Hippodrome as an example. They also had this funny one called the hoplite race, hoplitodromus, and that was the one where the hoplites would dress with their armor and shields, and they'd have a 100 meters race. So it's kind of a comical one they had. That was one they actually had, which was kind of weird. Women had their own games, which were mostly running type sports that they had. They were part of some segregated games that were known as the Heria, is what they call it, which honored the goddess Hera originally. They were segregated from the men. Some of the women couldn't watch, supposedly, but all the different competitions, I think men and women that were done, were all done in the nude, basically. They hardly wear any clothes. I do have some pictures showing like some of the Olympic games and all that sports they had, like the long jump. They use some kind of weights to help propel themselves forward. There's chariot racing. This one looks like they have clothes on, so maybe they did wear clothes for that competition right there. But most of them are in the nude. You can see like runners, pankration right there, wrestling. A lot of times they would cover themselves with olive oil, by the way. And discus throw right here, javelin, and the hoplitodromus also as well, which I just talked about a second ago. Now, what happened in the Olympics? Over time, they were banned. The Romans, if you know about it, became Christian. And so they think sometime in the 390s, like 393 CE or AD, I think that's the popular date anyway, they eventually were banned by this emperor named Theodosius I, who the Romans later called Theodosius the Great. And Theodosius the Great was the Roman emperor that basically made the whole Roman Empire Christian, a Christian nation or state. It was one of the first in the world like that. And they basically banned paganism, which included the spectacle of, running around naked, with, worshiping these pagan gods like Zeus and all that. And so they got rid of it. And of course, the Romans had converted to Christianity and all that. And so they didn't want to keep that anymore. So that's why they got rid of it. But you can see the Olympics were around for over 1,000 years at one point. They did bring back the games in modern times, which that started in 1896. It was mostly countries like Britain and France, etc., that basically added this modern version of the Olympic Games. And the point of why they developed the modern Olympics was because they were trying to create camaraderie among nations. Because, if you go back to 1800s, they were fighting a lot of wars. And so this was kind of a way maybe for countries to compete against each other without fighting war. Good that did with World War I and World War II that followed, though. And so, of course, in some cases, they suspended the Olympics, because of these, wars that did break out later. The first Olympic Games were actually held at Athens in 1896. And, they picked Athens because Athens was the birthplace, of course, of democracy and Western culture. And so that was the reason for it. I think the first games they held, of course, were summer games. And so after that, every 4 years, they would rotate summer games. And then in the early 20th century, they added winter games, which rotate each every 4 years, of course. So that's kind of where the Olympics came from and all that. But a lot of the games that they used to do, like in ancient times, aren't done as much like they used to. So some of them are done still today, like boxing, discus throwing, running, javelin, wrestling. I think those are the main ones they've got still today. I think in 1896 Olympics, they added the marathon run, which was something they got from the Pheidippides run idea, from a long time ago. But the marathon run was never a competition in the original ancient Olympics. All right, let me go ahead and move on, of course, and talk about other forms of Greek culture. Of course, now the Greeks also had like the so-called Greek drama plays. that they put on with, of course, culture in general. And there's only like a few surviving like playwrights from a long time ago that you really read about it. And there's like 4 of them that survived from a long time ago, which they talked about most of these guys, I think, in that little short video. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. They basically were the only ones that really survived from ancient times. And out of those different ones, Aeschylus was the first. He was the first, of course, of the different Greek playwrights that survived from ancient times. They think Aeschylus at one point wrote 70-something plays, and about 7 survived. And he's considered to be the father of the Greek tragedy. He wrote a series. He actually also is the father of the so-called trilogy, which is a 3-part play. Sometimes also today a 3-part movie. So we call it trilogy. And one of the first trilogies ever written was called Orestia, which is about the backdrop of the House of Atreus, which was kind of a tragic dynasty after the Trojan War ended. That's one associated with like Agamemnon, etc., and Menelaus. So Aeschylus was the first Greek to really start writing plays, more or less, which he wrote tragic type plays. Then they had Sophocles. Sophocles, is the one that's the most famous. He wrote 120-something plays originally, but only 7 survived, which is true about that little short video. And his most famous play, of course, was, you probably heard of this one. It's called Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, and it's considered a classic. It's the greatest Greek playwright ever written in ancient times. It tells the story of this man named Oedipus. There's an omen where he is slated to kill his father and marry his mother. And of course, in the end, ironically, he ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. When he finds out later, he gouges his eyes out. So a lot of the these Greek plays had a lot of irony in them. Euripides was another author later, Greek playwright. He wrote tragic plays as well. He wrote about 95 plays, and he had the most plays that survived, 18, which made him actually very popular later. In fact, Euripides ended up being a more popular playwright in the like later Hellenistic period that came after, because he had more plays and all that. And he had one play I know that was his most famous one they always talk about, which is Medea. And Medea was a play about divorce, believe it or not, which was rampant in the Greek world. And I think it's about you heard the story about the Jason, the Argonauts, the story of Jason, and he wanted to marry this younger woman and divorce his wife Medea. And Medea got jealous and killed all their children, basically. So kind of a tragic story, Aristophanes, of course, is another famous guy that was a playwright too as well. He wrote satires and comedy. And he, of course, was known as the so-called father of comedy. The guy that first started really doing comedy type stories and plays. And he wrote all kinds of plays. He wrote about 40 plays, and maybe 11 survive. And those are the 2 most famous plays he wrote. Lysistrata, which was an anti-war play, which was based on the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War. And it's a story about this woman named Lysistrata that tries to get the women, I think, of Athens to go on a sex strike to prevent their men from going to war. So it's like an anti-war play. And The Clouds is another classic type play that was a satire type play, which made fun of Socrates and may have helped to cause his downfall later, of course. And Socrates later would be, killed later overall. So kind of talking about, of course, Greek plays. And of course, later, Greek plays influenced modern plays, and like plays like Shakespeare later in modern times, were heavily influenced by, these kind of plays. Like he made like Julius Caesar and some of these other kind of plays that are kind of similar to that period. Then you have, of course, the Greeks developed philosophy, like Western philosophy, is something that they're kind of known for as well. Pretty much all the major questions of philosophy start with the Greeks: morals, aesthetics, basis of knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, science, etc. They think all originated from philosophy. Even history originated from philosophy and eventually broke up into different categories and fields. And they think Greek philosophy started around the 6th and 5th centuries BC. There was actually a guy named Thales of Miletus who lived about 600 BC. They think he may have been the one that started Greek philosophy, but they're not sure. But most of the early Greek philosophers were all mathematicians, which is true about that. The term philosophy comes from the word philosophos, which means in Greek love of wisdom or love of knowledge. Now, they always talk about the big three, the three, famous philosophers that were, the ones that were the most important to Greek philosophy in general. Those, of course, are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who all lived at one point in Athens. They lived between the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Now, the video, of course, talked about those three already a little bit, and I'll go more into detail about them today. Socrates, who you see in that picture, of course, was considered to be the first great philosopher that really developed in Greece at Athens. And he had his own school, they think, of some type, like some kind of early kind of philosophical school that first developed. And he went on to create this form of teaching method where he taught his students, which was called the Socratic or dialectic method. And the Socratic or dialectic method is a type of teaching method where you would use like a wide range of discussions where you would ask questions and answer with it. So students would ask you a question or you would ask them a question, and then you would give an answer or correct them, and then you could learn something more from that, like insight into the issue that they're talking about. So Socratic or dialectic method has been around forever. It was later used by other philosophers, teachers, etc., and still used today, of course, by modern educators as well today. Socrates was considered a genius. I think at one point the oracle at Delphi, Pythia, claimed that he was a genius, although Socrates kind of disagreed at one point and said that he didn't know anything. I know that nothing noble and good, I think is what he said, or something like that. And then the unexamined life is not worth living. Of course, that other quote that the video talked about is also a very common quote that Socrates is also known for. And what he meant by that quote was that he believed that if he couldn't do what he wanted to do, he didn't think it was worth to be living. Like if you can't, like I can't teach, I guess there's nothing else I can do. And so what happened was he got accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, like with his school, basically. And he became kind of a scapegoat during the Peloponnesian War that was kind of going on. It later led to his downfall, put on trial, and then eventually put to death, which is true about that. So he's kind of this tragic figure that they always talk about. And he was forced to basically, take poison, more or less. That's a very famous painting, by the way, by Jacques Louis David. It's painted in the 18th century. It was a famous painting that really painted more about the French Revolution, I think age of Napoleon, more or less. But he also was famous for painting like Greek and Roman historical events as well, like that one. So the so-called Death of Socrates. That's kind of romanticized, probably likely, but in that picture you can see he's getting ready to take the poison, the hemlock, before he committed suicide. Now they also got, of course, like I said, he had, of course, a very good pupil and student that was under him that was named Plato. Plato was basically, like I said, the best student of Socrates that was in whatever his school was. They're not sure the name of his school, what it was, but Plato's the one that will, eventually write down a lot of the dialogues of of Socrates. That's why we know a little bit about Socrates. And Plato ends up being the greatest philosopher, really, in the Greek world, and really the one that influenced the West the most when it comes to Western thought or Western philosophy in general. In fact, it's so influential, they called it Platonic philosophy, if you know that. And Plato was famous for founding a school that they usually call it the Academy, sometimes with a V or without the V. And it was founded in the early part of the 4th century BC, about maybe 387 BC. That's when it was started. And it was around a while. It was around until about Roman times, this school. I think for a while the Romans even reopened it again later. Now this school, like it said in the video, it was an example of one of the first major schools of higher learning, at least in the Western world. It was very similar to like a university or college or maybe even a high school, the way it was designed. And basically they taught all branches of philosophy. So they taught like sciences, math, they taught the arts, they taught warfare, they even taught like athletic stuff like sports and stuff like that, like colleges have and high schools have today. And so that was something he founded. Oh, by the way, the name Academy comes from the name Academos, which Academos was actually this Greek hero that he named the school after, believe it or not. And that's where you get the word academics from, or academia, that they use today. They describe like college and universities, I guess, overall. So that's who Plato was. Plato was known for writing a lot of his philosophy down, including what Socrates said. And so he wrote all kinds of books. He has numerous philosophical works that he wrote. Those are probably the two most famous that they always talk about, which is the Apology of Socrates, which goes into detail about Socrates and his death. Then also he's got the most famous work he did, of course, called The Republic, which is more of a political treatise more than anything, where Plato talks about the ideal state. And Plato believed that it wasn't a republic, which I know that's what they call it, the republic. But Plato believed that the ideal state was a monarchy where the ruler was highly educated. He called the ruler a philosopher king. So he believed that rulers should be educated and not be dummies and all that stuff. And so that was something that Plato kind of talked about. Now Plato, and by the way, I'll share this little picture here with you. Sometimes they call the Academy the School of Athens. That's another thing, of course, they do, which that's a very famous painting by Raphael Sanzio, who painted during the High Renaissance in the early 1500s. And of course, in that picture, you can see the guy in the middle here is Plato, and the guy to his right is Aristotle. Aristotle becomes, of course, the guy that will kind of replace Plato as the next great Greek philosopher. And Aristotle was a genius. He was a polymath. He pretty much studied all kinds of different fields. And he was originally from Macedonia. So he's a Macedonian Greek philosopher. And like I said, he was Plato's one of his best students. And after he graduated from the academy, he taught there for something like almost 20 years, roughly. And then later he went back to Macedonia, where he had his own school there also as well. You see, he's also kind of like an amateur type scientist as well. And in Macedonia, the king of Macedonia, who was King Philip II, or King Philip of Macedon, asked him to set up a school there to educate a lot of the children of the nobility. And so that's what he did. And when he was there, he, of course, met Alexander the Great, or what they call Alexander the Great later. And he had a major influence on Alexander's life, educating and tutoring him. And I think Alexander was about probably middle school, high school, when he was taught by Aristotle. And that was like one genius to another there. And Aristotle heavily influenced him. In fact, he gave him a copy of the Iliad, which I think it was annotated with like notes in it and stuff like that. And Alexander the Great loved the Iliad of Homer. Actually saw himself as almost like the new Achilles or something like that. And so I think that's why Alexander later conquers the world or tries to conquer the world, because of Aristotle telling him about the rest of the world. And I think he was the one that told Alexander that there was a great ocean to the east. He tried to march there to try to get it. Aristotle had his own school too, of course. Of course, in the video they call it the Lyceum, but it was actually this philosophical school that he founded in a temple in Athens called the Lyceum Temple. So it's sometimes called the Lyceum for short. However, people didn't really call it that back then. They called it the Peripatetic School. The Peripatetic School. It was called that because Aristotle would actually walk around to different parts of the temple, and he would basically talk to his students, I guess, and try to educate them. And that's why they call it the Peripatetic School, which means, by the way, to walk around. So it actually means the walk around school is what it meant. Makes you wonder if he had ADD or something, couldn't sit still. And so that's kind of what professors do normally in colleges, when you, of course, meet face to face, is that you would, go from classroom to classroom, like on campus or whatever. That's pretty much what that same thing is, I guess. Also, Aristotle. And by the way, the school itself was famous for concentrating on the scientific fields. Aristotle was an amateur scientist. He would actually collect specimens from all over the world, like animal and plant specimens. And supposedly when Alexander the Great began conquering like the Near East, like Persian Empire and all that, Alexander sent him back animal and plant specimens because he was real interested in that. But you can see he was a jack of all trades. He was a polymath. He was into biology, physics, astronomy, botany, zoology, etc., all kinds of other fields. And they do think that Aristotle was one of the most influential Greek philosophers that influenced a lot of like later science, like medieval science, like the whole, four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Or the geocentric model was supposedly something that Aristotle influenced later, they think, which was the idea that all the planets and the sun revolve around the earth. So they think all that kind of originally originated back to the Greeks a long time ago. All right, so that's enough about Greek culture. Let me also talk about for a few minutes as well on the Greek gods and Greek mythology as well, which, the Greeks were known for having numerous gods that they worshiped. They had a huge pantheon of gods overall. And under the Greeks, religion played a major role, just like the Romans have in other societies that come later. And the Greeks, of course, believed in a lot of gods, like 100-something gods or more that they worshipped, more or less. But the Greeks did narrow their gods down to a certain few that were kind of seen as being the most important overall. And the chief gods that were seen as the most important were the 12 Olympians, sometimes called the Olympians for short, which you may have heard of before. And the Greeks actually called it Dodecathion, which meant in Greek 12 gods, because it mostly had just 12 of them in there. And it's debate about who the 12 are, and all of that. And the Olympians were these gods that had taken over the earth, basically. They fought against these other gods that you may have heard of that were called the Titans. The Titans were these giant immortal gods that had helped, settle the earth a long time ago. And they were gods like Kronos and Rhea, Oceanus, you may have heard of that, Prometheus and Atlas. Although the original founder of the Titans were Uranus and Gaia, it was originally called Earth, husband and wife there. And what happened over time, Kronos had children which rebelled against him. They had the so-called, War of the Titans or Titanmachy. And what happened was the Olympians overthrew the Titans and took over the Earth. That's what happened. And Kronos had three main sons: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. And after they took over the world, they divided up the whole world among them, basically. So Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the oceans and seas, and then Hades got the underworld. That's how they divide everything up, pretty much. Also, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades also had three sisters, of course, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. Hera, of course, is also the wife of Zeus, if you know about that, which is kind of weird, but yeah. And then Zeus's children, of course, or Athena, Apollo, Dionysus, Aphrodite, Hermes, Artemis, Ares, and Hephaestus. Those are all most of the children there. You do notice in that slide that Hades is in red instead of yellow. The reason why is because Hades is usually not counted as one of the 12 Olympians because he lives in the underworld. Most of these gods, resided on Mount Olympus, which was this mountain, of course, that's today in northern Greece. But the Greeks, like ancient Greeks, really believed that the gods lived there, like on Mount Olympus. It's all, of course, a bunch of mythology, from a long time ago. I do have slides, of course, on the different gods. I can go through real quick. Zeus, of course, was called different names. Of course, if you see the parentheses names, those are names, of course, that are the Roman names. So Zeus was often called Jupiter or Jove. He was known as the Thunder Maker. He, of course, carried a weapon, which was a thunderbolt. Was seen as the father of the gods and also the god that ruled over the sky, basically. So he's the supreme god. He's the leader of the Olympians and the one that everybody looks up to, more or less. His wife is Hera, who the Romans later called Juno, which is where you get the month June from later. She, of course, is the wife and sister of Zeus. She's a mother goddess, I guess, and she's often associated with things like marriage, childbirth, and also dealing with women in general. But those two in mythology never really get along. In fact, Zeus is always cheating on Hera, if you know about it. And Zeus had a lot of different children with other women, like especially mortal type women. Of course, the brothers, you have Poseidon, of course, Neptune, as they call him, with his famous trident, which is a type of weapon he had. And Poseidon was the god, like I said, of the oceans and seas. He's also the guy that caused earthquakes. It's also this guy that supposedly created the horse for some reason. And Poseidon is famous for living in the ocean. He has a palace in the ocean, but he kind of goes back and forth between what is basically Mount Olympus and the ocean. Hades, of course, they later call him Pluto. It's using the name they really called him. And Hades was the other brother of Zeus and Poseidon. He, of course, was the god that ruled over the underworld, which is also called Hades, but his real name is really Pluto. Pluto is known for having this weapon, really kind of armor, which was called the cape of invisibility, or also called the helm of darkness. And what it did was it made you invisible. Hestia, of course, one of the sisters of Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, etc. She was the goddess of the hearth, which is the so-called eternal flame, and she was often associated with the home in general, which Greeks and Romans later would keep like eternal flame, which represented the home and the hearth and all that. She's later called Vesta, of course, by the Romans. Demeter was called Ceres by the Romans. She was the goddess of the harvest and grain, associated with agriculture. So she's not as well known compared to some of the other brothers and sisters that they have. They're related to Zeus. Her daughter is Persephone. You may have heard of her, who was later, of course, married to Hades. I don't know if you know it, but she's associated with why the seasons change. Supposedly, when Persephone goes to live with Hades, winter would come, and when she would come back to be with her mother, Demeter, spring would come. So it's kind of weird the way that is. Athena, of course, one of the, daughters of Zeus. Of course, the Romans later call her Minerva. She was associated with war and, of course, culture, arts, also kind of a god of peace. She, of course, is where the Athens gets its name. That's their patron goddess. And there's a story where supposedly when Zeus got angry one day, she popped out of his forehead. And that's how he was born. Athena was one of like three virgin goddesses, by the way. Apollo, another son of Zeus, is a god of sun, light, poetry, knowledge, prophecy, etc., truth. There's Apollo. Apollo does not have another name. So the Romans also called him Apollo. Apollo is especially associated with prophecy. There's a lot of temples in Greece, like at Delphi, maybe the one at also on Delos as well, have oracles that can tell you your future, especially one at Delphi. Dionysus, of course, also called Bacchus, of course, a very popular god of later. It's a god of wine and fertility. They think he's not by the way, one of the 12 Olympians originally. That's why he's in red. And he's very popular, god of wine. Dionysus is big with a lot of Greco-Roman cults where wine is used, where they have lots of parties, orgies, and he was very popular with also women. It was associated with fertility, etc. Aphrodite, of course, was one of the famous daughters of Zeus. She was the goddess of beauty and love. Right there, of course, the Romans called her Venus. They make later a lot of statues of her. She was considered the most beautiful of all the goddesses, especially originally picked by Paris, of course, in the Iliad story. Our son is Eros, and Eros, of course, was the god of erotic love, or also called sexual love. He later, of course, gets connected to what we call St. Valentine's Day. Hermes. Hermes, of course, is the messenger god of Zeus, later called Mercury by the Romans. He's associated with a lot of things. Commerce, like dealing with like business and stuff like that, and making money. Luck and fortune also as well. A lot of athletes would worship him. And also thieves, because Hermes was, of course, believed to be fast. He was known for having wings on his feet and wings on his helmet. And so he's kind of a popular god with a lot of people. Artemis, also known by the Romans being called Diana, was the goddess, of course, of mostly the hunting, basically. And she's associated with like the moon also, and also kind of seen as a protector of children. A lot of parents would worship her to protect their children and stuff like that. And she was later called the so-called virgin huntress, they dubbed her. Ares, of course, is also known as Mars, which was the god of war. And of course, that particular god was also a son of Zeus. He's later famous as a lover of Aphrodite in a lot of mythology. And so that's where Eros or Cupid comes from. That's basically their son in a lot of mythologies. And Ares was not very popular with the Greeks, believe it or not. But the Romans liked him. And of course, Romulus and Remus, which I'll get to later, who were the founders of Rome, were considered to be somehow related to him. At least they theorized that, but that's all probably mythology. So he's usually in the form of a soldier of some type. Then Hephaestus, another Olympian, also called Vulcan by the Romans, was the god of fire and metallurgy. He was called the blacksmith of the gods, and he was known for making like weapons and tools. He's the one that made the thunderbolt of Zeus, the trident of Poseidon. He made the helm of darkness for Hades. He also made weapons, and like I suppose the shield of Achilles was made by Hephaestus. In Perseus, I think, and some other guys had kind of stuff from him as well. I don't think I'm going to review this section because we just covered that lecture-wise. So just you can go back and review that real quick if you want. That I just covered. So I just did that. Let me go ahead and move. I want to move on, and of course, get into just for a few minutes today, talk a little bit about the background, of course, about the rise of Macedonia. So I did want to talk a little bit about that today, or at least talk about the background of it, and that might be it for today, more or less. And we have what they call the Hellenistic age that comes in later. The Hellenistic age is this period that kind of comes in around the 4th century, and it goes up to the 1st century BC. So it lasts about 3 centuries, more or less, which I've talked about. Usually 323 to about 30 BC. So it's around 300 years. And during that period, you have a period where Macedonia comes to power. And I'll kind of get into that, who they were. The Macedonians were a Greek state and also a kingdom that emerged in the 4th century BC. They either call it Macedon or Macedonia, which today Macedonia is the more common name that they use, but it was located in the northern part of Greece, above all the major part of the Greek city-states that were there. I do got a map showing you where Macedonia was. You can see it's kind of an area, they call it Macedon a long time ago. And you can see it's above Thessaly, which Thessaly's like right here. You got Thrace over here. So it's kind of between Thessaly and Thrace. And it's kind of in the northwestern part of the Aegean Basin area. So right up here. Part of it's in like the northern part of Greece. And then part of it's, I think, now in Macedonia. I think kind of a mix of the two today in modern times. And the term Macedonia, if you study about it, kind of get into that. What's the proper name to actually call it? They believe it came from a name Macedon, Makedon. And Macedon was some kind of ancestor of theirs, like a chieftain or king that lived a long time ago, kind of like the guy Helen of the Hellenes. And supposedly in Greek it means tall one. Although sometimes they'll say also Highlander as well. And I think it's partially because maybe they were taller than average other Greeks. And then some claim it's because of the mountains of Macedonia, because they were Highlanders from the mountains. And over time, the name Macedon became Macedon. They kind of slurred it. The K is a C. And so Macedon or Macedonia is the name that they, of course, eventually called it over time. Macedonia is the common name, of course, today that they use. Now, one of their first major kings that's important, not the first one, but he's one of the first big kings you hear about in Macedonia, of course, is King Philip II, who was also called Philip of Macedon or Macedonia. And he reigned from about 359 to 336 BC. There's a statue of him right there. I think I've got more than one statue that I got of him as well. Got one down here you can see too of other statues. He was kind of this warlike king who also actually lost an eye in battle at one point. And he was famous for developing a lot of their military tactics. That's one thing that's important because his son will kind of adopt a lot of these ideas later on. And the Macedonian military had a combination of use of cavalry and infantry that they would use in battle together. And it was later called the so-called sword and shield tactic that was well known. The cavalry would use as a sword, as an offensive weapon, and the infantry would be used as a shield, usually in the center of their army. And then they put the cavalry on the wings, left or right, to try to attack the flanks of an enemy to kind of break through. And a lot of the Macedonian hoplite infantry relied on these long spears that were called pikes. They're about 18 feet long, double the size of the traditional dory or hoplite spear. They used these in formations, which had to be welded with two hands. Very, very difficult. And the Greeks called the hoplite pike or long spear, they called it a sarissa. And a lot of the infantry was called different names. I think someone called the foot companions, I think is what they were called. But they were known as the Macedonian phalanx or pike soldiers as well. Pike phalanx, basically. Also, the Macedonians had a cavalry that became pretty good as well, which was later called the companion cavalry. Considered one of the first major elite cavalries in the world. It was developed by King Philip, and by the time of Alexander, it was expanded up to maybe 3,000 men that were in it, which most of them were like mostly upper class elite that were in it. And he'd used, like I said, the companion cavalry was later used as basically a offensive weapon to attack enemy flanks especially gaps in their flanks. And Alexander at one point led a lot of the companion cavalry early on, and then later when he, of course, invaded Persia on down the line. And I do have a picture showing you like the use of the Macedonian phalanx with the pikes. The pikes they use, the pike phalanx, and they use pikes up to modern times. I want to say up to the English Civil War, they were using pikes in general. And a lot of times they use pikes because it was a type of weapon to help stop the advance of cavalry at an army. And that's why it was actually used. Philip also he was married multiple times, and he had a famous wife that was well known as Queen Olympias, who was from Epirus, which is where Albania is today. And she, of course, eventually became known as the mother of Alexander the Great, who was eventually born in 356 BC. And so she was very powerful, especially after Philip died. She was kind of influential behind Alexander's life, and even influenced him, I think, when he was on the throne as well. Philip later invaded Greece and eventually took it over, and he forced all the Greek states down there to eventually form an alliance, which was known as the League of Corinth, which was also called the Hellenic or Greek League. So I think founded in 338 BC. And so all those states you see that are in yellow eventually formed this alliance, and they believe the idea of this alliance over time was to kind of unite all the Greek states as maybe one power later. But later, Philip had this idea to eventually conquer the Persian Empire. They still had this idea to try to free Greeks that were under Persian rule, like in the Aegean. And so Philip has that idea, but he never gets to it because he ends up, getting assassinated. It's something that happens, of course, to him. So yeah, the League of Corinth was an idea of his, where they could unite the states together and then go after the Persians. And Alexander will do that, and not him, because he basically ends up getting killed. And so in 336 BC, he was at this royal banquet, which I think was a wedding, and one of his ex-bodyguards got up and stabbed him. And there are all kinds of theories circulating that the Persians were behind it. There was a theory that, of course, Queen Olympias was behind it as well. There was even another theory that just kind of been put forth too, that Pausanias was an ex-lover of Philip. Because if you know about the Greeks, they were known for being bisexual. He was kind of mad. I guess he dumped him or whatever and stabbed him to death, but they don't know if that's really true or not. It might be a made-up story about that later. But because of that, what ends up happening, because, the fact that Philip has been killed, Alexander III, who's later called Alexander the Great, is allowed to seize power at that point and take over the empire. And he's going to eventually come in and take over. He's only 20 years old. He's going to reign from 336 to 323. I do have a little short video I can share with you real quick, just to kind of give you some background on Alexander. That's it for today. But let me go ahead and run it real quick for you. Just a little brief life about Alexander real quick.
One of the most powerful figures in history was Alexander the Great. He was born in 356 BC in Macedonia, which is now modern-day Greece. Alexander's parents were King Philip II and Queen Olympias. They raised him to be strong and well-accomplished. He learned to play musical instruments, swim, hunt, and ride horses. In fact, when he was 12 years old, he was given the challenge of taming a black colt that none of the soldiers in the kingdom could tame. King Philip said that he would give his son the horse if he could tame it. Alexander was successful and named the horse Bucephalus. It accompanied him on his many travels throughout his life. When Alexander was 16 years old, King Philip went off to battle and left Macedonia in the care of his son. The people of Macedonia tried to rebel against Alexander, but this was a bad idea. Even though he was 16 years old, he was able to lead his army and deal with the rebels swiftly. Alexander went on to conquer more cities throughout Europe and Asia. He was known for naming cities after himself or things that were important to him, like he named a city after his horse, Bucephalus. Alexander never had any sons, so when he died, there was no one to leave his great empire to. His top 3 generals decided to split the kingdom up into 3 parts, one for each of them. Alexander spent his life leading and conquering, rightfully earning the name Alexander the Great.
Well, this little short little video kind of gave you a little information about Alexander. But anyway, that's it for today. Again, I want to remind you about, don't forget, of course, about assignments. I've got, 2 right now that you've got, of course, to deal with. Of course, one, of course, which is the first exam. You need to wrap that up this week. And then, of course, I do have the new assignment, of course, I've got on ancient India for you to start working on, which is due next week, actually. And that's it. So don't forget, I am going to post this video to my YouTube channel afterwards. So if you got any comments, questions, let me know about the lecture. And that's it for today. Hope you all have a good week the rest of the week. I'll be back Friday, of course, to kind of talk about Alexander the Great and, of course, wrap up that. Okay, so that's it for of course, today's lecture overall. So take care.